Today we're going to talk about quadratic equations. So we'll start with the definition. A quadratic equation is an equation that can be written of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Notice there's one x squared term, one x term, and one number term all on one side of the equation and 0 on the other. So for example, if we wanted to take the equation 5x squared minus 4x plus 11 equals x minus 2 times x plus 1 and put that in general form, well then we're going to need to get everything on one side of the equal sign and 0 on the other. So we're going to have to start by taking this x minus 2 times x plus 1 and distributing that out. When we do, we get x times x times 1, negative 2 times x, negative 2 times 1. We can combine these like terms, and now we have 5x squared minus 4x plus 11 is equal to x squared minus x minus 2. But this isn't still quite in general form because we need everything on one side of the equal sign. So we need to bring the x squared over by subtracting it, the negative x over by adding it, and the negative 2 over by adding it. And we get 4x squared minus 3x plus 13 equals 0. And now that is in general form. Now remember, a is the number in front of the x squared, so that would be 4. B is the number in front of the x, so that would be negative 3. And c is the number that doesn't have an x, so that would be 13. So what we're going to really focus on today is solving quadratic equations. There are two methods we are going to discuss about how to solve quadratic equations. The first method is by factoring. How do we do this? First thing we're going to do is put the equation in general form. Get everything on one side of the equal sign, 0 on the other. Have one x squared term, one x term, and one number term. Then we're going to factor. And then what we'll do is we'll set each factor equal to 0 and solve separately to get your solutions. So, for example, 4 minus 9x squared equals 0. We're going to solve that by factoring. Well, as you can see, everything is on one side of the equal sign and 0 is on the other. Now this is a special case because there is no x term, so if you wanted to write it in general form, then you would have negative 9x squared plus 0x plus 4. But that seems like a lot of extra work. So we are going to solve this by factoring. So take a look. We have 4 minus 9x squared. We have the difference of two perfect squares. Remember, these quadratic equations could be the difference of two perfect squares. So this factors into base 1 plus base 2 times base 1 minus base 2. Once you have it factored, then you can set each factor equal to 0 and solve separately. 2 plus 3x equals 0, 2 minus 3x equals 0. So on both of these, I'll subtract the 2 from both sides. And then this one I'll divide by a positive 3, and this one I'll divide by a negative 3. And I get two solutions to this quadratic equation. Negative 2/3, and remember, a negative over a negative is a positive, so x is positive 2/3. Let's do another example. The profit from the sales of x unit of a product can be modeled by p of x equals 9x minus 20 minus 0.1x squared. What level or levels of production will yield a profit of $120? So I want to know, what is x? What is the x value that's going to make this entire profit function equal to $120? So I'm going to take the profit function, 9x minus 20 minus 0.1x squared, and set it equal to 120. Now I'm going to put it in general form. Get everything on one side of the equal sign, 0 on the other, one x squared term, one x term, one no x term. And I'm going to go ahead and put it in descending order. So when I subtract the 120 from both sides, I get the negative 140, but in descending order, negative 0.1x squared plus 9x minus 140 equals 0. So now I want to solve this by factoring. But I've got this decimal right here, which makes things a little bit, I don't know, annoying. Well, you can do whatever you want to an equation, as long as whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So in a perfect world, this leading coefficient here would be a 1, a positive 1. So what can I do to make that a positive 1? I can multiply it by negative 10. Now you can only do this to equations when you have things set equal to each other. So I'm going to take this entire equation and I'm going to multiply by negative 10. Remember, whatever you do to the left-hand side, you do to the right-hand side. So I'm going to multiply the entire left-hand side by negative 10 and the entire right-hand side by negative 10. So I need to distribute this negative 10, and I will get a positive x squared minus 90x plus 1400, and then 0 times negative 10 is 0. Now this is much more something that looks a little bit easier to factor. So that x squared minus 90x plus 1400, that's going to factor nicely into x minus 20 times x minus 70. So now that I have it factored, I will set each factor equal to 0 and solve separately, and I get 20 and 70. So this means that our profit is going to hit $120 twice, when we produce and sell 20 units and when we produce and sell 70 units. Now the second method of solving quadratic equations we're going to talk about is using the quadratic formula. Now the steps here are going to start very similar to the ones by factoring. We're going to put the equation in general form, but this time we're going to determine what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of the x squared term, b is the number in front of the x, c is the number that doesn't have an x. And then we're going to solve by using the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's do an example. Let's solve 2x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals x squared plus 9 using the quadratic formula. The first thing we need to do is get this in general form. So we're going to need to get everything on one side of the equal sign, 0 on the other. So I'll subtract the x squared and I will subtract the 9. And I get x squared minus 4x minus 4 equals 0. Now, the best method of solving quadratics is to factor because it's generally the quickest. However, this function is not factorable, so we're going to have to use the quadratic formula. So we need to determine what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of the x squared term, b is the number in front of the x, c is the number that doesn't have an x. So we get a is 1, b is negative 4, and c is negative 4. Now that we know what a, b, and c are, we just plug them straight into the quadratic formula. So remember we said b is negative 4. So negative 4 plus or minus negative 4 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 4, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So now we'll simplify. A double negative makes a positive. Negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 4 is 16, all over 2. Now that 16 plus 16 gives us 32. Now we always want to simplify this as much as possible. So we have 4 plus or minus the square root of 32 over 2. Well, what is 32? That's 16 times 2. And remember when we talked about radicals way back in chapter 0, we said if you don't have addition or subtraction inside the radical, you can distribute the radical. So the square root of 16 times 2 is the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. Well, we know the square root of 16 is 4, so we have 4 plus or minus 4 root 2, all over 2. And so now what we're going to want to do is simplify. We're dividing this entire numerator by 2, which means we divide each of the pieces by 2. So we can simplify the 4 divided by 2 and the 4 divided by 2, which gives us 2 plus or minus 2 root 2. So we end up with two answers. X equals 2 plus 2 root 2, and x equals 2 minus 2 root 2. A lot of times when you use the quadratic formula, you will end up with radicals in your answers. Now pay close attention. If it's going to ask you for decimal approximations, then you would put this into your calculator and round. Remember, WebAssign is very particular about rounding. The last thing I want to mention here is if you're using the quadratic formula to solve, if you end up trying to take the square root of a negative number, remember you're not allowed to take the square root of a negative, so that would mean that there are no solutions. Okay, we'll do some more practice when I see you next time.